Colton stood in the hospital hallway holding a small velvet box when Dr. Patterson grabbed his shoulder and said the words that would change everything. "You can't marry her, Colton. She's dying." The doctor's voice cracked as he spoke, and Colton felt his whole world stop spinning right there under those bright hospital lights. But Colton looked Dr. Patterson straight in the eyes with tears rolling down his face and said something that made the doctor step back in shock. "I know she's dying, doctor, and that's exactly why I need to marry her today." The doctor opened his mouth to argue, but Colton was already running down that hallway toward room 304, where the love of his life was waiting, and nothing in this world was going to stop him from making Janelle his wife. 6 months earlier, Colton had been just another lonely guy working at his family's bookstore in downtown Atlanta. He was 32 years old and had given up on finding real love after 3 failed relationships that left him feeling empty inside. His mama always told him that love finds you when you stop looking for it, but Colton didn't believe in that kind of talk anymore. Then on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in April, a young woman rushed into his bookstore soaking wet and laughing at herself for forgetting her umbrella again. She had the most beautiful smile Colton had ever seen, and her dark eyes sparkled with a joy that seemed to light up the whole store. She walked up to the counter shaking water from her braids and asked if he had any books about living life to the fullest. Colton remembered thinking that was an odd request, but something about her made him want to help. He spent the next hour showing her different books, and they talked about dreams and fears and all the things that people usually keep hidden inside. Her name was Janelle, and she told him she was a second-grade teacher who loved her students more than anything in the world. Before she left that day, she wrote her phone number on a bookmark and told Colton that he seemed like someone who understood that life was precious. He called her that same night, and they talked until 3 in the morning about everything and nothing at all. Their first date was at a small Ethiopian restaurant where Janelle taught Colton how to eat injera with his hands, and they laughed so hard that other people in the restaurant started smiling just from watching them. Colton learned that Janelle had grown up in a small town in South Carolina with her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident when she was just 9 years old. She told him how her grandmother taught her that every single day was a gift and that loving people was the only thing that really mattered in this world. Colton shared his own story about how his father left when he was young and how his mother worked 2 jobs to keep their bookstore open and put food on the table. Something about being with Janelle made Colton feel like he could finally breathe after holding his breath for years. They started seeing each other every single day, and Colton found himself falling in love faster than he ever thought possible. Janelle had this way of making ordinary moments feel magical, like when they would sit in his bookstore after closing time reading poetry to each other, or when they would drive to the lake at sunrise just to watch the world wake up together. 3 months into their relationship, Colton knew with absolute certainty that Janelle was the person he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. He started planning how he would propose and even bought a small diamond ring that cost him 3 months of savings, but he didn't care because Janelle was worth everything. But then everything changed on a Sunday morning in July when Colton got a phone call that made his blood run cold. It was Janelle's best friend Shanice, and she was crying so hard that Colton could barely understand what she was saying. "You need to come to St. Joseph's Hospital right now," Shanice said between sobs. "It's Janelle. She collapsed at church this morning." Colton drove to that hospital, breaking every speed limit and praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. When he got to the emergency room, Shanice was there waiting, and she hugged him tight before telling him what the doctors had found. Janelle had stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and it had already spread throughout her body. The doctor said she had maybe 6 months to live and maybe less. Colton felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart until it stopped beating. He couldn't breathe and couldn't think and couldn't understand how this was possible. Janelle was only 29 years old, and she was the healthiest person he knew. She ran 3 miles every morning and ate salads for lunch and never missed her yearly checkups. How could someone so full of life be dying? When they finally let Colton go back to see her, he found Janelle sitting up in her hospital bed looking small and scared, but still trying to smile. "I'm so sorry, Colton," she whispered as tears ran down her beautiful face. "I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now." Colton didn't understand what she meant, and then Janelle explained that she had been feeling sick for months, but kept ignoring the symptoms because she was scared of what doctors might find. She had been having stomach pains and losing weight, but she told herself it was just stress from work. By the time she finally went to see a doctor, the cancer had already taken over and there was nothing they could do except make her comfortable for the time she had left. Colton sat on the edge of that hospital bed and took Janelle's hands in his and told her something that came from the deepest part of his soul. "I don't care about the cancer, Janelle. I love you, and that's not going to change no matter what happens. We're going to fight this together, and we're going to make every single day count." But Janelle pulled her hands away and shook her head with fresh tears streaming down her face. "No, Colton, you need to leave. You need to walk away right now and find someone healthy who can give you the life you deserve. I won't let you waste your time watching me die." Colton felt anger rise up in his chest, and he stood up from that bed and said words that he meant with everything in him. "Don't you dare tell me that loving you is a waste of time. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I'm not going anywhere." But Janelle kept pushing him away day after day and week after week, telling him to leave and find happiness somewhere else. She stopped answering his calls, and when he showed up at her apartment, she wouldn't open the door. Colton felt like he was losing his mind, because the woman he loved was slipping away, and she wouldn't let him help her. He talked to Shanice and Janelle's grandmother, Miss Betty, and they both told him the same thing. Janelle was scared, and she was trying to protect him from the pain that was coming. But Colton didn't want to be protected. He wanted to be with Janelle, no matter what. Finally, after 2 weeks of being shut out, Colton did something crazy. He showed up at Janelle's apartment at midnight with a boombox playing their favorite song, just like in those old movies his mama loved. The neighbors started yelling at him to turn it down, but Colton didn't care. He stood there in the parking lot and shouted up at Janelle's window, "I love you, Janelle Robinson, and I don't care who knows it. You can push me away 1,000 times, and I'll come back 1,001 times. We don't get to choose how much time we have, but we do get to choose how we spend it, and I choose you." The lights in apartments all around started turning on, and people were looking out their windows, but Colton kept going. "You taught me that every day is precious, and that loving people is what matters most. So let me love you, Janelle. Let me be here with you for whatever time we have left." Finally, Janelle's window opened, and she looked down at him with tears shining in the moonlight. "You're crazy, Colton Hayes," she called down to him. "Crazy in love with you," Colton shouted back, and he heard people laughing and clapping from other windows. 5 minutes later, Janelle came downstairs and fell into his arms, and they both cried together right there in that parking lot. "I'm so scared, Colton," she whispered against his chest. "I'm scared too, baby," Colton told her. "But we're going to face this fear together." From that night on, Colton never left Janelle's side. He went with her to every doctor's appointment and held her hand through every test and every scan. The doctors tried different treatments, but Dr. Patterson, who had become Janelle's main oncologist, was honest with them. The cancer was too aggressive and had spread too far. The treatments might buy them a little more time, but they couldn't stop what was coming. Colton watched the woman he loved get weaker with each passing week. Janelle had to stop teaching because she didn't have the energy anymore, and that broke her heart, because those kids meant everything to her. Her students made her cards and videos telling her how much they loved her, and Colton would sit with Janelle while she watched them and cried. Some days were better than others, and on the good days Colton would take Janelle on small adventures. They went to the aquarium and held hands while watching the fish swim by. They had picnics in the park where they first said "I love you" to each other. They stayed up late, watching old movies and eating ice cream straight from the carton. Colton took 1,000,000 pictures because he wanted to remember every single moment. He wanted to freeze time and live in those perfect moments forever, but time kept moving forward like it always does. One evening in late September, Colton and Janelle were sitting on her couch watching the sunset through her window when Janelle turned to him with a serious look on her face. "Colton, I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "I've been thinking a lot about what happens after I'm gone, and I need you to promise me something." Colton felt his throat tighten, but he nodded for her to continue. "Promise me that you'll keep living after I'm gone. Promise me you'll fall in love again and get married and have babies and do all the things we talked about doing together." Colton started shaking his head before she even finished talking. "I can't promise you that, Janelle. I don't want anyone else. I only want you." But Janelle grabbed his face with both hands and made him look at her. "Listen to me, Colton Hayes. My life is ending, but yours isn't. You have so many years ahead of you and so much love left to give. Don't let my death be the thing that stops you from living. Promise me." Colton felt tears running down his face, and he couldn't speak, so he just held Janelle close and breathed in the smell of her hair and tried to memorize the feeling of her in his arms. That night after Janelle fell asleep, Colton sat in her kitchen with Miss Betty, who had moved in to help take care of her granddaughter. The old woman made him a cup of tea, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while before Miss Betty spoke. "That girl loves you more than life itself, Colton. I see it in the way she looks at you." Colton nodded because he knew it was true. He could feel Janelle's love in every smile and every touch and every moment they shared. Miss Betty reached across the table and patted his hand with her weathered fingers. "You're a good man, Colton. You could have run when things got hard, but you stayed. That takes real love and real courage." Colton felt his eyes fill with tears again, and he whispered the question that had been haunting him for weeks. "How do I say goodbye to her, Miss Betty? How do I let her go?" The old woman smiled sadly and said something that Colton would never forget. "You don't let her go, baby. You hold her close for as long as you can, and then you carry her in your heart for the rest of your life. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form." In October, Janelle's condition got worse, and she had to be admitted to the hospital. The cancer was causing her terrible pain, and the doctors needed to manage it with stronger medications. Colton barely left her room, and the nurses brought him blankets and pillows so he could sleep in the chair next to her bed. Dr. Patterson checked on Janelle multiple times. A day in Colton could see the sadness in his eyes. The doctor had grown to care about Janelle over the months of treatment, and it was clear that losing her was affecting him too. One afternoon when Janelle was sleeping, Dr. Patterson pulled Colton aside in the hallway. "Colton, I need to prepare you for what's coming. Janelle probably has a few weeks left at most. Maybe a month if we're lucky." The doctor's voice was gentle but firm. "You should start thinking about final arrangements and making sure you say everything you need to say to her." Colton felt like the floor was falling out from under him, but he thanked the doctor and went back to Janelle's room. He sat by her bed watching her sleep, and that's when he made his decision. He was going to marry Janelle before she died. He didn't care what anyone thought or what obstacles stood in his way. He was going to make Janelle his wife. Colton spent the next few days planning in secret with help from Shanice and Miss Betty. He got a marriage license and arranged for a pastor from Miss Betty's church to come perform the ceremony. He bought Janelle a simple white dress that would be comfortable for her to wear in the hospital bed. He ordered flowers and a small cake and called everyone who loved Janelle to invite them to the wedding. His own mama thought he was crazy at first. "Colton, baby, are you sure about this?" she asked him on the phone. "Getting married to someone who's dying, isn't that going to make the grief even harder?" But Colton explained to his mama what was in his heart. Marrying Janelle won't make losing her harder, Mom. Nothing could make that harder. But it will mean that we got to have this one perfect thing before she goes. We get to stand in front of everyone we love and promise ourselves to each other. We get to be husband and wife, even if it's only for a little while." His mama was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, baby. Okay, I'll be there and I'll bring tissues for everyone." The morning of the wedding, Colton was so nervous his hands were shaking as he got dressed in a suit that Shanice had helped him pick out. He had arranged everything to happen that afternoon in Janelle's hospital room. But when he got to the hospital, Dr. Patterson was waiting for him in the hallway with a grim expression. "Colton, we need to talk," the doctor said urgently. "I can't let you do this. I can't let you marry Janelle today." Colton felt panic rise in his chest, and he demanded to know why. Dr. Patterson ran his hands through his hair, looking distressed. "Because she took a turn last night, Colton. Her organs are starting to fail. She might not make it through the weekend." The doctor's eyes were red like he'd been crying. "If you marry her today, you could be a widower by tomorrow. Is that really what you want?" Colton felt tears streaming down his face, but his voice was steady when he answered, "Yes, doctor, that's exactly what I want. I want to be Janelle's husband for whatever time she is left, even if it's only a day or an hour. I need her to know that I chose her completely and forever." Dr. Patterson grabbed Colton's shoulder, and that's when he said those words that would echo in Colton's memory forever. "You can't marry her, Colton. She's dying." The doctor's voice cracked with emotion, and Colton could see that Dr. Patterson was trying to protect him from more pain. But Colton looked the doctor straight in the eyes with tears rolling down his face and said, "I know she's dying, doctor, and that's exactly why I need to marry her today. I need her to leave this world knowing that she was loved completely. I need her to be my wife." The two men stood there in that hospital hallway, and Dr. Patterson finally nodded and stepped aside. "Go marry your girl, Colton," he said quietly. And Colton ran down that hallway toward room 304, where everything was waiting. When Colton opened the door to Janelle's room, he stopped breathing. Shanice and Miss Betty had transformed that sterile hospital room into something beautiful. There were white roses everywhere, and soft music playing, and candles burning safely in glass holders. And there in the hospital bed, wearing the white dress he had bought her, was Janelle. She looked so beautiful it hurt Colton's heart. Her head was wrapped in a gold scarf, and her face was thin, but her eyes were shining with love and joy. "Colton," she whispered as he walked to her bedside. "Shanice told me what you were planning. Are you sure about this? Are you sure you want to marry someone who's about to leave you?" Colton knelt beside her bed and took her hand and kissed it gently. "Janelle Robinson, I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life. You are my love and my light and my everything. I want to be your husband for whatever time God gives us. Will you marry me?" Janelle started crying and nodding and saying yes over and over again. The ceremony was small and perfect. Pastor Johnson from Miss Betty's church stood at the foot of Janelle's bed and read verses about love never failing. Colton's mama was there crying happy tears, and Shanice was the maid of honor, and Miss Betty sat in the corner smiling through her own tears. Dr. Patterson and several of the nurses who had cared for Janelle stood in the doorway watching, because they had all grown to love her too. When it was time for vows, Colton held Janelle's hands and spoke from his heart. "Janelle, you taught me how to really live. You taught me that every moment is precious and that love is the only thing that matters. You are the bravest person I've ever known, and I am honored to be your husband. I promise to love you with everything I have for as long as we both shall live." Janelle was crying too hard to say much, but she whispered, "I promise to love you forever, Colton. Forever and always." When Pastor Johnson pronounced them husband and wife, Colton leaned down and kissed his bride gently, and everyone in that room was crying, including Dr. Patterson, who had to step out into the hallway to compose himself. They celebrated with cake and sparkling cider, and everyone shared their favorite memories of Janelle. The nurses brought in extra chairs, and people laughed and cried and told stories. Janelle was getting tired, but she was smiling wider than Colton had seen her smile in months. "This is the happiest day of my life," she told him as she leaned against his chest. "I'm somebody's wife. I'm your wife, Colton." And Colton held her close and said, "You're my wife, and I'm the luckiest man in the world." The party went on for hours, and when everyone finally left, Colton climbed into that hospital bed next to Janelle and held her carefully. They watched the sunset together through the hospital window, and Janelle whispered, "I love you." Colton Hayes over and over until she fell asleep. Colton stayed awake watching his wife sleep and thanking God for every moment they had together. He knew their time was short, but right then in that moment, they were husband and wife, and that was everything. Janelle lived for 2 more weeks after the wedding, and they were the most bittersweet days of Colton's life. She was in and out of consciousness, but in her clear moments, she would smile at Colton and call him my husband. Miss Betty and Colton took turns sitting with her and making sure she was never alone. Shanice brought flowers every day and read to Janelle from her favorite books. Colton's mama came and prayed over Janelle and told her that she was going to take care of Colton after she was gone. Dr. Patterson stopped by every morning and evening, and Colton could see how much it hurt him to watch Janelle fade away. On a quiet Tuesday morning in November, with autumn sunlight streaming through the window, Janelle opened her eyes and looked at Colton with perfect clarity. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for loving me. Thank you for marrying me. Thank you for showing me what it means to be cherished." Colton was crying so hard he could barely speak, but he managed to say, "You don't have to thank me, Janelle. Loving you was the easiest thing I ever did." Janelle smiled that beautiful smile one more time and said, "I'll wait for you, Colton. Wherever I'm going, I'll wait for you until we can be together again." And then she closed her eyes and took her last breath with Colton holding her hand. The funeral was held on a bright Saturday morning, and it seemed like the whole city of Atlanta showed up to say goodbye to Janelle. Her second-grade students came with their parents, and each child brought a drawing they had made for their beloved teacher. The church was packed with people whose lives Janelle had touched with her kindness and joy. Colton stood at the front and tried to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. Finally, he just said, "My wife taught me that love is stronger than death, and I will carry her in my heart until the day I see her again." Miss Betty sang Amazing Grace in a voice that made everyone weep, and Shanice read a poem about how the brightest lights burn the shortest time. Dr. Patterson came to the funeral, and he found Colton afterward and hugged him tight. "You did the right thing, Colton," he said. "You gave her the greatest gift. You showed her that her life mattered and that she was loved. That's all any of us want in the end." In the months after Janelle died, Colton thought he might die from grief. The pain was so deep and so wide that he didn't know how to keep breathing. But slowly, with help from his mama and Miss Betty and Shanice, he learned how to carry his loss. He went back to working at the bookstore, and he started a small scholarship fund for teachers in Janelle's name. On what would have been their first anniversary, Colton visited Janelle's grave and told her about all the things that had happened in the year since she left. "I kept my promise, Janelle," he said to the headstone. "I'm still living. Some days it's really hard, but I'm doing it. I'm living for both of us now." And as Colton sat there in that quiet cemetery, he felt something shift inside him. The grief was still there and would always be there, but there was something else too. There was gratitude. Gratitude for the time they had together, and for the love they shared, and for the way Janelle changed his life forever. 3 years later, Colton was restocking shelves in his bookstore when a young woman came in asking for books about grief. Colton recognized that look in her eyes because he had seen it in his own mirror many times. He spent an hour talking with her about loss and healing and how love never really ends. When she left, she thanked him and said, "You really understand." Colton smiled and said, "I had a good teacher." That night, Colton looked at the wedding photo on his bedside table, the one of him and Janelle in that hospital room, both of them smiling like they had all the time in the world. "Thank you, baby," he whispered to the photo. "Thank you for teaching me how to love without fear. Thank you for showing me that the time we have matters more than how much time we get. And thank you for waiting for me, because I know you are." Colton turned off the light and closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Janelle was gone, but she wasn't lost. She lived in his heart and in his memories and in every act of love he performed in her honor. Their story hadn't ended the way he wanted, but it had been real and beautiful and worth every moment of pain. And that was enough. That had to be enough. Colton fell asleep that night with a smile on his face, dreaming of the day when he would see his wife again, and they would have forever, just like she promised. Colton would remember the sensation of that hallway forever. The way the linoleum thudded under his shoes, as if it were a drum calling him forward. The medicinal brightness that made everything feel too real to be a dream, and yet too impossible to be real. The way his own breath sounded like a stranger's in his throat, because in that run toward room 304, he crossed a border he hadn't known existed. The thin place between the world where you hope and the world where you decide. And when he pushed open the door and saw white roses crowding out the smell of antiseptic, candles trembling behind safe glass, and Janelle in that simple dress with a gold scarf crowning her, he felt the clean pain of joy pierce through the dirty ache of fear. And for one astonished heartbeat, he believed time might tilt and wait for them. It didn't, of course, but they made it kneel for an afternoon while a pastor's voice braided scripture with the soft rustle of nurses trying not to cry, while Miss Betty's hands were folded like a benediction in her lap, and Shanice held a bouquet that shook with every quiet sob, while Colton's mama dabbed at her eyes and smiled so fiercely it looked like a dare to grief itself. And while Dr. Patterson, grim guardian of bad news, stood in the doorway like a soldier at a gate and finally let his face break because love had out-argued medicine. Vows were small words made large by the mouths that said them and the dying body that received them. And when Colton spoke, the room seemed to lean closer, as if walls and monitors wanted to hear how a man could promise forever inside a clock that had only hours left. And when he kissed his bride, he learned that tenderness has a weight to it, that you can feel it in your bones the way you feel a storm turning the air. Later there was cake and laughter and stories. The kind of stories that tugged time backward for a few blessed minutes, second graders' videos on a tablet, passed from hand to hand. A memory about a field trip where Janelle turned a bus breakdown into a roadside poetry slam. Miss Betty recounting how a 9-year-old orphan learned to pray with her whole body. Shanice telling the one about Janelle's first classroom where the heater clanked and she taught the kids to clap back at it until the beat made math less scary, and then the room emptied and the sky loosened into pink. And Colton climbed carefully into the bed and held his wife, not with the frantic grip of a man about to lose something, but with the reverence of a man entrusted with something holy. He slept in breaths and jerked wakes, cataloging the small miracles, the way her fingers found his without looking, the soft whistle of her exhale, the fleeting half-smile that visited her face, even in dreams, because cataloging was a way to keep breathing, and breathing was a way to keep faith. The next 2 weeks were a map whose edges burned inward, mornings of clarity that broke like glass into afternoons of fog, jokes that chased morphine with something sweeter, prayers that were less about intervention than about accompaniment, and always the new language of the nearly finished. Thank you, I see you, I'm here. I'm yours until the Tuesday, when the light came in thin and golden and Janelle's eyes opened with that steady brightness he had first seen in a rain-slick bookstore. And she said words that turned his ribs into a bell. Thank you for loving me. And he told her the truth that had been true. Every hour since April, loving you was the easiest thing. And then her breath left like a tide pulling back beyond sight. And he sat inside a silence that was not empty, but crowded with everything they had said and everything they had been. The city gathered to say her name out loud, the way you say a prayer you don't want God to forget. Little hands clutching drawings of suns and stick-figure teachers with capes. Men from the church in suits that smelled faintly of starch and aftershave. Women with tissues tucked into sleeves. Miss Betty's voice pouring amazing grace into the rafters until even the doubters hummed along. And Dr. Patterson, no longer a messenger but a mourner, telling Colton with a hug that choosing love had not been foolishness but fidelity. Afterward there were casseroles and cards, and the stunned errand of picking up ashes. And then there was the long winter where grief taught its curriculum, how mornings are heavier than nights. How the world keeps insisting on normal with its junk mail and traffic lights. How a man can be two people at once, the one who smiles at customers and counts the till correctly and recommends the right book for a lonely afternoon, and the one who at closing time puts his head down on the counter and sobs, like a child because the right book for a lonely life doesn't exist. Spring came without asking permission, and with it a sliver of color, first in the tulips outside the bookstore, then in the scholarship applications for Janelle's fund that arrived in hopeful envelopes, and finally in the faces of young teachers who reminded him that legacy is just love that learned to travel without a body. On their would-be anniversary, he sat by the stone that bears her name and told her about the aquarium trips he now sponsored for second graders. About Miss Betty's pound cake winning first prize at the church social. About Shanice who laughs again, but always touches the locket with Janelle's picture before she does. About his mama who keeps 2 chairs at Sunday dinner and sets the spare with the good napkin. And about the way the bookstore has become a little sanctuary for the wounded. A place where grief comes in asking for something to read and leaves with a book and a promise that somebody else has survived this. Years turned like pages and softened at the edges. And one autumn evening a woman stood in the poetry aisle and asked for help with sorrow. And he recognized the particular tilt of her shoulders, the careful way she handled the word widow like it might cut her hand. And he spoke to her the way Janelle had spoken to him, plain, kind, believing that people can hold hard truths if someone will hold them too. After she left, he turned the sign to closed and stared at the wedding photo that sits behind the register candles and cords and roses, and a girl whose eyes could outshine morphine drips, and said thank you again, because gratitude had become the shadow cast by the love that still shone, and because he understood now what Miss Betty meant about forms changing. He dreamed less about bargaining and more about reunion, less about the last breath and more about the first laugh he would hear again. And in the meantime he practiced the sacrament of ordinary faithfulness, restocking shelves, stamping the insides of books with a rubber mark that read, "For Janelle," reminding any customer who needed it that joy is not a betrayal of what you've lost, but a way of telling the truth about what you were given. Sometimes at dusk he drove to the lake where they used to read sunrise into being, and he let the twilight write its quiet across the water. And he would imagine a shoreline just beyond the visible one, another morning waiting. A woman with long dark curls standing with her hands on her hips pretending to be impatient. And he'd say, not aloud, but not exactly in his head either, almost, "Babe, I'm still doing the things. I'm keeping the promises. I'm living for both of us." And then he would go home to the bookstore apartment that smelled like paper and lemon oil, set his keys in the dish she had picked out at a craft fair, and sleep, not because the ache was gone, but because love had taught him how to rest inside it. And when he woke, he would rise to meet another day that did not grant him forever, but did offer him enough time to help a customer, enough laughter with his mama and Miss Betty on the phone, enough sunlight to make the dust in the front window look like confetti, enough courage to keep doing the next good thing. And sometimes, when the doorbell chimed and a child ran in waving a new library card, or when Shanice stopped by and made him listen to a song Janelle had adored, he felt the soft, unmistakable pressure of a palm between his shoulders, as if someone were steadying him from the other side of the thin place. And he would smile without turning around because he already knew. Love had not saved Janelle's body, but it had saved their story. And it kept saving him, one ordinary, sacred, more than enough day at a time.